As we did for the first episode, let's see a few verses that succinctly give us a quick sense of the meaning of the second scandal episode of Myth Culture's pattern, and the second diffusion episode of Jesus' unique divine pattern. In Matthew 18:7, we read that Jesus declared, "Woe to the world because of its scandals! Woe to that man through whom the scandal comes." And then in Matthew 16:23, Jesus said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, you're a scandal to me." As we learned in the method chapter, scandal is the obstruction or the blocking of desire. When a person imitates another person's desire and then feels blocked from accessing or from realizing his or her borrowed desire, that's scandal. That's what scandal is. And Jesus says, "Woe to the world because of these daily scandals of desire that lead to frustration and conflict and violence and death." And Jesus said to Apostle Peter, when Peter opposed God's will for Jesus' will, that Peter was a scandal, a stumbling block to Jesus, since Peter attempted to block Jesus' desire to do his Father's desire. But Jesus would not allow Peter to thwart his will. And indeed, Peter could not possibly impede Jesus' pattern from unfolding. And we'll see that as we work through the gospel account together. Yet this verse shows that Peter was one who scandalizes, who is a stumbling block to others, who walks in myth culture's pattern, being a scandal to others. But we read in Romans 14:21 and 1 Corinthians 8:13 that Jesus' pattern is not to be a scandal to others. The scandal doesn't originate with Jesus, and it shouldn't for Christians either. That shouldn't originate with us. We're not to scandalize others, but rather, as Apostle Paul writes in Romans 14, "It is good not to do anything by which your brother is scandalized." So he writes in 1 Corinthians 8:13, "I will not cause my brother to be scandalized." So the Christian's to do everything in his or her power to not block the desire of another, but rather let the other's desire be more important than one's own desire, as Christ models in the gospel accounts, as we're looking at. Now, even though the Christian, and even though Christ himself did and does that, others may be scandalized nevertheless. And we're going to see that today as well, that even though Jesus did everything in his power to not scandalize others, the scandal arose from the hearts of the others anyways. Not from Jesus, but they were scandalized anyway, because sinners walk in the pattern of myth culture, and it's inexorable, really, apart from the intervention of God in your heart, in your spirit, that the myth cultural pattern will unfold in the hearts of fallen, sinful people anyways. And so we'll see that. But let it not be possible to say accurately, truthfully, that the Christian caused the scandal. That's our desire as Christians to imitate Christ in that way, the pattern that he walks in the gospel accounts behaviorally. And we're going to see that truthfully, Jesus is never the cause of the scandal. Rather, the scandal arises, as I said, from the selfish hearts of sinners inured in the pattern of myth culture, who move from sameness, which we looked at last time, to scandal, in that pattern that just continues like a cycle repeating itself. But scandal never originates in Jesus. We're going to see that Jesus consistently diffuses scandal, and so fails to conform to myth culture's pattern. So that'll be another demonstration of our assertion that Jesus is not mythological. So further, in terms of overview, the second episode of the gospel account begins with Jesus calling his disciples in Mark 1 verse 16, and it'll continue through to Mark 8:26. The second episode is the largest of the 6 episodes of the gospel account, of the 2 patterns in the gospel accounts, as we mentioned before. And the focus in the second episode here shifts away from a primarily sameness distinction emphasis, as viewed through the social scientific lens, to a primarily scandal diffusion emphasis, myth culture scandal, Jesus divine diffusion, which together will continue the chiastic bi-pattern in episode 2. In the gospel account, the second episode ends with Jesus miraculously feeding thousands of people in the wilderness. We won't get that far today, simply because of the size of this episode. It's about 8 chapters of Mark's gospel account. Mark's gospel account's 16 chapters in total, so it's an enormous chunk. And so it felt best to divide up this chapter, the sixth chapter of the book, Jesus and Myth, and the second episode of the pattern, into two. So we're going to look at the third motif today and the fourth motif that concludes the second episode next time. But the episode as a whole is characterized by a contrast between the people of Israel, both leaders and commoners, becoming increasingly scandalized toward Jesus, and Jesus repeatedly diffusing their gathering offense with his graciousness, his creation of space, and his generosity. Perfect keeping with his Father. Jesus is God, and he has all the characteristics of God, of course. He didn't shed any of that in his incarnation, and we see it on display in contrast with the evil hearts and behaviors of men. The first and last verses of this second episode are determined by noting the positions of the beginning and end of the myth motifs of this episode. So I talked a little bit before about how we identify where motifs begin and end and episodes begin and end. It has to do with looking for the characteristic themes that we are familiar with now by looking at actual combat myths, so that when we come to the gospel accounts, we can look for those themes, those motifs, and ascertain where they fall in the gospel account. And the two motifs, as I said, that make up episode 2, the Scandal Diffusion episode, are donor council and journey, in that order, if it's a myth. If it's the myth's pattern, donor council and then journey. But just as in the first sameness distinction episode, in this second episode, these two motifs are reversed in Jesus. In his identity, his actions, and his words, Jesus begins not with donor council, but with journey. So we'll see Jesus journeying first. But not only is the order reversed, but the significance, Jesus' journey is not, it does not possess the meaning that journey does in the myth pattern. He subverts both order and significance of myth, demonstrating thereby that he's not mythological. In the myth pattern, Zeus is first counseled, so the donor council motif occurs first in the second episode, as we'd expect, with Zeus being counseled, and then secondly taking his journey. In the gospel account, Jesus first journeys, takes a peripatetic journey gathering disciples and ministering the gospel of the kingdom, and then thereafter, secondly, in this episode, as the fourth motif for Jesus, he has an atypical donor council motif that concludes the second episode for Jesus. Meanwhile, we'll see everyone around Jesus, particularly the world's powers, the evil spirits and the authorities, the Pharisees and Herodians and scribes, etc. They follow myth's pattern. They have their donor council first, just as the gods and monsters of myth do, and they have their journey second. And so that's an amazing thing to learn, that rather than Jesus being myth, it's everyone else, and in particular the world's powers, who are mythological in fact.